Good afternoon. My name is Jung Min Lee. I am from LSK Global Pharma Service. I'm currently in charge of pharmacovigilance. So that was the standard disclaimer. And I would like to introduce E2B R3 and look at the data elements and also Korean guideline. So introduction to E2B R3. E2B is electronics transmission of individual case safety reports. So anyone who's involved in pharmacovigilance will be quite familiar to this term. And for people who aren't involved in that field, might find this a little familiar, so I'd like to go over the basics. Start with the basics. So we're talking about ICH guideline, and E2 is a section on pharmacovigilance. There are so many subgroups under E2. So we have E2A, B, C, D, E, F, and for A and D, they are about expedited reporting and terminology, post-market and pre-market, and then RMP and GCR, PPR, RER. Those kinds of report regulations or provisions are provided there. But today we will be talking about E2B R3. So R3 means revision number 3. This is the latest version. So we can see that other content don't have multiple versions, and we have E2B and E2C multiple versions. So this is constantly being enhanced. So what is pharmacovigilance? So pharmakon is medicinal substances in Greek, and vigilia in Latin means to keep watch. So it's constant keeping watch over the safety of medicinal substance. So from the development stage to the end of its marketing, pharmacovigilance constantly goes on. And at WHO or Korean pharmaceutical safety related regulations also state the definition of pharmacovigilance. So adverse events for pharmaceuticals, vaccines, that kind will be detected and assessed and understood. All of the scientific activity related to that is called pharmacovigilance. So it might sound a little abstract, but we would now look at how pharmacovigilance does that. I believe that the most basic PV process goes across these 3 steps. So we have data handling and then data collection, and then we get the signal detection. And then with the signals, we go into risk assessment of the pharmaceutical. And of course, we have to have data to be able to do that. And without collection of such data, pharmacovigilance work that follows cannot be possible. So that is why we need expedited reporting to regulators. So before marketing, SAR has to be reported within 15 days, 17 days, and then there's also a regulation that requires reporting to the regulators within a number of days after marketing. I believe everyone takes medications at one point in their time, and people might experience adverse events. And I don't believe many of the general public who would think of reporting to or filing a report with the regulators when they have experienced an adverse event. So that's why it has to be made mandatory for expedited report and PPR reporting regulations, and all of this data has to come together to be communicated. And so the decision has to be made whether this can continue to be marketed or any measures have to be taken regarding the pharmaceutical. So ongoing management of the pharmaceuticals and medicinal products is what PV is about. So from the stage of data collection, E2B R3 is quite significant and relevant. So now we look at ICSR, Individual Case Safety Report. And for electronic transport or transmission of that is the guidelines for that is provided in E2B. And so in clinical trials, An assay report can also constitute an ICSR. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the term ICSR, if we don't have any labeling of that, it will be just individual information on an assay. So FDA and EMA have their own definitions. So anyway, they both point out that individual patient or subject experiencing adverse drug experience will be described in the ICSR. So for example, if you take the assay report, SAE arises, it has to be communicated to the pharmaceutical company quite quickly. And we actually had an instance where an SAE, a blank SAE, was submitted to us. It wasn't filled out. They were required to turn it in within 24 hours. So they did want to turn in something, but they didn't have time to fill out the form. So that's why we have minimum information for valid ICSRs. So there has to be information on one identifiable patient, and we also have to have information on one identifiable reporter and what adverse event or reaction or outcome had been observed, and also one suspect or interacting drug. It also has to be reported. So these are the minimum information required for ICSR, and that is the data that is collected and measured and then compiled. So ICSR would be submitted in various forms. So for clinical trials, we would get SAE reports, and from overseas partners, COMS report is the quite often found format, and in the US, MedWatch report is another form that is used. And these days, the most favored format is E2B XML file, because this is really convenient and easy to manage. And for this, we have to look at whether there were any overlapping redundant cases, and it will be entered into the database. So it would be entered into the database and then do the quality control and then review and look at it whether it has to be undergo expedited reporting. And then medical coding is also a process that is involved. So we have medical coding and then drug coding. And then we have case narrative. So in COMS, they're not of blank brackets, but actually you can see the large blank space in the middle, and that's where the case narrative goes. And in Korea, SAE case narrative is like one or two sentences, but in overseas cases, overseas are recipients of the reports have to be able require that the case narrative can be understood on its own. So within the database, manual work is not required. And for E2B is how automatically all the data fields are entered in without manual work. So if electronic files are exchanged, there has to be standardization for efficient management. So the form that is turned into MFDS, the format that is turned into FDA or EMA would differ. Then every time the file would have to be modified when it's reported to different regulators. But if the company and the recipient are using a uniform format, then it's much easier and convenient and efficient to exchange the data. And regardless of the source, regardless of post-market or pre-market, it's all the same. And it's not only for SAE or drug AE, but all AEs. Pre-market in Korea for SUSAR, they have to be reported to MFDS. But for post-market surveillance, what takes place after everything is done, the large-scale reporting in E2B was quite a burden because the data was generated from the database. And if the database is not there, then all of the data has to be entered in on a manual basis, and that required a lot of work. So regulators are accepting such information on a standardized format, and that also encourages standardization across all stakeholders. And it should be independent of platform and vendor and application. So it follows an international standard that is platform, application, and vendor independent. So for a pharmaceutical product, when we have a safety information, it would be reported to a pharmaceutical company, a regulatory authority, and RAs would be exchanging the information. And the data in the past had been exchanged on a paper basis, for example, CIOMS. But to make that process more efficient, electronic transmission of such information has been implemented, and that was the purpose of E2B. So Danny earlier had walked us through in detail the history of E2B. So from 1997, which was more than 20 years ago, the discussion began and the guidelines were developed. And E2B R3 went into step 4 in November 2012. But Danny mentioned earlier that some are still reporting according to revision 2 because the recipient also has to be in R3 format. So the guidelines have been effectuated for since more than a decade ago, but each company or each regulator might have different standards implemented, whether it's going to be R2 or R3. So that's why we still don't have uniform standardization around the world. And standard development organizations worked together to make it more standardized. And step 4 is, of course, adoption. And the guidelines were R3 guidelines were begun to be adopted in Europe in November 2012. And so I mentioned SDOs earlier, ISO Health Level 7, International Health Terminology Standards Development Organization, GS1, and CEN and CDISC are some organizations that work together for standardization. And Danny mentioned some details here, went through quite a lot of detail on this topic. So ISO IDMP includes identifiers to allow mapping, and MEDRA looks at coding for history of the patient's history, and concomitant drugs and also the indications should also be coded. And the MEDRA code for the tests or the exams that were conducted are also coded. So this requires even more fields than we had when we were doing the large-scale reporting in the past. And then we have ICH maintained code sets and international standard code sets, and then null flavor is another piece of terminology that constitutes E2B R3. And I won't go into more detail because this has been already described in Danny's presentation. And MEDRA stands for Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities. It looks at adverse events and also it's coding for medical history. It was developed by ICH Expert Working Group and it's maintained by Maintenance Support Service Organization. Is updated twice a year. And so in Korea, in 2019, September 1st, the Korean version has been distributed. Each meta term is assigned an 8-digit numeric code. For example, the term headache, if that is reported, then the LLT would be headache, and it would be assigned code of 100192111. And the E2B R3 file, we would have only the information 100192111 instead of headache. So of course, if you just take a look at the XML file, it won't make sense to people. But the MEDRA is translated across many languages around the world. And whatever the language is, if we look at the 8-digit numerical code, then it all points to the same thing. And only one MEDRA version is allowed per ICSR. That's the rule of thumb. And MEDRA is going to code a lot. So we look at the AE and the medical history and the testing and the exams. And then lab, if, for example, lab test results have to be coded, the versions should be uniform. So only one MEDRA version is allowed per ICSR, and it should also state which MEDRA version it was coded to. So what are the advantages to electronic submissions? First of all, exchange and processing ICSR data is done on a very efficient basis. And it also facilitates the sharing and the transferring of information to organizations that need it. And it also enables automatically routing and processing of incoming messages. Also, safety data has to be aggregated, and it is also facilitated in electronic submissions. And last, I would like to highlight it minimizes resources required, because if 200 reports are made on a daily basis for entry and quality control every day, it just takes too much work. So we are able to save all of that time. So its value increases with the growing number of cases. So I believe some of you might have seen an XML file, what it looks like. So does this make any sense to you? Does this information make any sense to you? So this file includes information on an adverse event, but this was put into a numerical 8-digit code, and it's just numbers to us. So this is this isn't for human interpretation. It's for facilitating data exchange between databases. So it's for machines. So XML files is not for immediate human use. And no flavor was also touched upon by Danny earlier. And this is a field that explains the reason for the missing data. So there would be NI, which stands for no information, and then we would MSK, which would stand for masking. And for example, in Europe, because of privacy reasons, some data might have to be masked. And there might be some unknown data and NA not applicable. So no proper value is applicable in this context. For example, when you're asking last menstrual period for a male, then it's not applicable. Asked but unknown is another code, and then not asked, this information has not been sought. Null flavor doesn't apply to all elements. There are rules as to which element can be applied no information. So null flavor is allowed. Specific null flavor codes are allowed for elements. So for a specific field, if only NI or no information is allowed, then only that would be allowed. And the XML file should be built based on these rules. So no flavors in addition to the third revision of E2B. So that was the purpose of ICH E2B R3, and now we would look at the data elements. So data bits are grouped to 7 sections. So E stands for event, and F is for test, and G is for drug information. And the sections can be repeated as needed. And the other sections are unique. They're not repeatable. And this is also a very similar diagram to that of Danny. On the left-hand side, we have Section A, Administrative and Identification Information. So this is the information on the ICSR, where it comes from, who was reporting them, and their unique identifier numbers. On the right-hand side, we have Section B. This is information on the case. Which patient experienced which adverse event, and what was the suspect drug. So details on the case are provided on the right-hand side. So the black dots and the white dots were also described in the previous presentation. So whether it's optional or mandatory, is it repeatable? So that is incorporated into the diagram. So N1 would be the first. N1 is the batch wrapper. So it's sort of a wrapper or an envelope to a case. So we are sending a number of letters or messages. They would be put into wrappers as identifiers. And on the next level, we have 2 Rs, which would be the headers that are for the many messages or the many letters that go into the one wrapper. So multiple ICSRs might go into one wrapper, and in Korea sometimes these batch wrappers are used for reporting a PMS. And then C is identification of the case safety report. So the highlighted in orange rows they can be repeated. So it says C.2.R and CA.4.R. For C1, identification of the case safety report, of course this is not repeatable. C.2.R, primary sources of information. There might be multiple primary sources, so repeat as necessary. And C3, or rather C43, literature references. There might be multiple references. And C5, study identification. This is unique, so it can't be repeated. So to look at the scheme, we can see which can be repeated and which cannot. And one thing I would like to draw your attention to here is that in C, if there was an SAE, there would be initial report, and then we would have follow-up 1, 2, and 3. And so on. But for revision 3, there aren't any SAE multiple versions. So the versions would not be identified, but the generation date is actually captured. So we can just look at the date. So that is a difference from the previous version. And C.1.10.R, we see identification number of the report, which is linked to this report. So if there is a report made on the same patient, then there would be a link between those two. And C.1.8.1, worldwide unique case identification should be the same as the initial report and the follow-up report. And C.1.11.1, report nullification amendment. In amendment or nullification, it is important to use the same sender's safety report unique identifier and worldwide unique case identification as the one that was previously submitted. And then we have C.2, C.3, C4, and C5. So D is about patient characterization. So there's so many elements and so many items, and one thing I would like to highlight here is we have body and then height. In the guidelines, body allows decimals, fractions or decimals are allowed, but for height, only rounded numbers are allowed. So in the CRF, the heights and weights or they might come from the SAE. And what would the completion guide say? For example, for height, if it allows decimals, then what are we going to do if the height is 165.5? Are we going to state it as 165 or 166? So the completion guidelines should also correspond to what is allowed here. In Korea, any drug is built according to E2B R3. Not sure if you can see the text here, but if there's a green triangle in the left-hand upper corner, this is essential information. So you can see the name or the initial is the essential one. So if this is filled out, then we can move on to the next page. So that is for section D. And then data elements E, we have one reaction or one event. A minimum of a reaction or event has to be provided for each valid ICSR. And so death, life-threatening, a cause for hospitalization, there's the information that you can see. And if this person didn't die, but was only hospitalized, in the past, we would mark hospitalized and leave the other elements as blank. But we can see value allowed, true and null flavor. In that case, we would mark no under death to fill out the XML. In terms of seriousness criteria, the value allowed would be true or NI. So you also have to choose yes or no according to the situation. And F is for the test or procedure for a certain event. And when a test is run, we might have physical quantities or results, which would be positive or negative. Or shadowing of right lung, this kind of unstructured free text would also be possible. So this also has to be coded according to MEDRA code rules. And for example, if a GPT test was run, then since we have the 8 digits for MEDRA code, that code would be included into the XML file. And G is for drug. This section includes both suspect and concomitant medications. So this is allowed to be repeated as necessary. And the drugs that are used to treat the reaction or event should not be included here. And also one thing that is interesting about drug is how it is expressed. So in R2, if one dose of 10 milligrams were taken per day, this was how it was expressed. However, in R3, we don't go by 3 doses a day. We actually mark it to say that the doses are taken every 8 hours. So we divide 24 hours by 3 doses. And then we have to look at the frequency. For example, in case A, 5 milligrams were taken 3 times a day. So we would enter in dose 5 and unit mg. And interval, we would divide the 3 doses 1 day by 3 doses. So we come to 0.33. And for case B, 5 milligrams were taken every other day. So on the frequency time enter, we would have dose 5 under dose and mg under dose. And then because it's taken every other day, the interval would be 2 because the interval unit is day. And then to look at the frequency number of units in the interval, you can select from the drop-down list multiple elements. But you have to be very clear at the unit. So if it's going to be hours, then you might enter in 8. But if you're going to go by the unit of day, then because it's taken 3 times a day, you would divide 1 day by 3 and then write down 0.33. And H is for narrative. So it should be interpreted on a standalone basis. So in Korea, the reporters provide very brief descriptions, but overseas, they provide a more full description. And in narrative case summary, native language can be provided. So not only English, but also Korean, a native language, can be included in the narrative case summary in revision 3. And CIOMS 1 form is the format that we most often use. And if you go into COMS website, you can look at the form, and there you can find a link that maps the elements to the ICH E2B R2 and R3 guideline elements. And acknowledgement messages, how this works was also addressed in the previous presentation. When we're doing electronic reporting to regulators or other entities, that database would send out an acknowledgement or a warning, or it might not be received at all. So in the past, within 24 hours of getting a report, there would be a reply that tells the sender, the reporter, that the information was received. This serves a similar function. If we send information, acknowledgement message should come in, and if not, that means that the message was not delivered properly. And if an error code comes as a response, then we should address it accordingly. So this is how communication is exchanged to make sure that information is acknowledged as received. Now, lastly, E2B R3 guidelines of Korea. So there's not much difference in how the guidelines are implemented in Korea. Since we have become an ICH member, ICH E2B was one of the guidelines that we had to implement. So MFDS has built its database based on E2B R3 format. So we were speaking about step 4 and step 5 earlier, and step 4 is the adoption stage for the ICH harmonized guideline, and step 5 is the implementation stage. So if you go to the ICH website, you can see the implementation status of each country, and you can see that Republic of Korea has implemented step 5 in 2021 December, and there's E2B RC Q and A. And if you can see the implementation status, here, step 5, we can also see So actually, E2B R3 was implemented on November 2020, and the E2B R3 Q&As have been implemented in Korea in December 2021. So here we have the guidelines, ICH E2B R3 guidelines, electronic reporting guidelines for drug adverse reactions and case safety, and item validation rule for drug or element validation rule for drug adverse reaction and adverse events, and FAQ on post-market ICSR system for Korea and overseas, and E2B R3 based drug ICSR online. A training video and video on reporting post-market AE per reporter. Also, instructions on review of completeness of local drug ICSR. And so Denny mentioned that the people who are in charge of this should constantly keep themselves updated by checking the website updates. In Korea, any drug platform is already built in E2B R3, and we are collecting data according to E2B R3 format. So you have to go into the MFDS site and go into customer support to find any drug. So the URL is nedrug.mfds.go.kr. So Korea-specific data elements for E2B R3 amount to 14 elements. 0 under mandatory, and we have 9 under conditional mandatory, and 5 are optional. So we have a total of 14 Korea-specific data elements. I will go into a little more detail later on. In terms of N is, I said it's a batch wrapper. So the receiver identifier, the reporter identifier. In Korea, the clinical trial for receiver ID and foreign clinical trial receiver ID identifier are provided. And on the horizontal axis, we have the test environment identifier. And if you have to send such batch information, you can check the identifier for MFDS here. And then section C, we have 3 Korea-specific data elements in section C. On the top, other health professional type. So we have nurse and then other. If you look at this, you might believe that only information. We have only nurses and other health professionals. But if you go to C.3.2.R.4, there's no other. We have like physicians and lawyers and nurses. So these are nurse and other are Korea-specific data elements. C.3.1, health professional type. Korea provides more detailed information on the type of the health provider, whether it's clinic or pharmacy or public health center or other. And C.5.4.KR.1, we look at the other studies type because there are a lot of reevaluation studies. So we have the reports on use results under reevaluation study, and then reports on post-market clinical research and reports on special inquiry. And these are not mandatory elements. And under section D, we have for pharmaceuticals. D and G are for pharmaceuticals. I'm not sure if you remember, I did mention earlier that D is patient information. So D for patient information, what would that be? So this is the history of medications taken by that patient. So the version has to be written down. For WHO Drug Global C3 short version. And for medicinal product ID, it would differ between Korea and overseas. For domestic ICSR, we would put MFDS DD code, and for overseas ICSR, we would use WHO drug MPID C3. So this is an essential element. So if a patient had taken previously a drug that was post-market overseas AE, then the information would be provided accordingly. And then here we look at whether past or current history. And then we also would have substance version and substance ID. For Korea, we look at MFDS ingredient code for substance ID, and for overseas, WHO Drug Global C3 CAS number. So overseas usually requires XML file, and we can do that also accordingly. And in terms of G, causality assessment, method of assessment would be either WHO UMC or KRCT. This isn't essential element. The result of assessment for KRCT, relevant or not relevant, that would be stated. And then conditionally essential. And for WHO UMC result of assessment, we have certain probable, possible, unlikely, conditional, unclassified, unaccessible, unclassifiable, and no flavor is included. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.